Old cemeteries have always been a source of fascination for many of us, and for good reason. These historic resting places hold secrets and stories that have been buried for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. From the crumbling headstones to the rustling leaves of ancient trees, there's something inherently captivating about the atmosphere of an old cemetery. There's something undeniably eerie about cemeteries, don't you think? The moment you step through the rusty gates, you can't help but feel a shiver run down your spine. It's as if the whispers of the past linger in the air, warning you to tread carefully. From the flickering lanterns to the creaking trees, every element seems to contribute to this sense of unease. Perhaps it's the fact that cemeteries are often shrouded in mystery, with secrets and stories that only the dead know. Maybe it's the way the silence seems to swallow you whole, making you feel like you're walking on sacred ground. Whatever the reason, cemeteries have a way of tapping into our deep-seated fear of the unknown. It's no wonder, then, that cemeteries have become a hotbed for ghostly tales and urban legends. From vengeful spirits to restless souls, the stories are endless, and the imagination runs wild. And yet, despite the fear that grips us, we're drawn to these places, like moths to a flame. Let's venture into the world of spine-tingling stories, shall we? Take, for instance, the tale of the LaLaurie House in New Orleans. This 19th-century mansion-turned-cemetery is said to be haunted by the tormented spirits of slaves who were brutally treated by Madame LaLaurie herself. Visitors have reported strange occurrences, from disembodied voices to apparitions in old-fashioned clothing. Then there's the famous St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, also in New Orleans, where the infamous voodoo queen, Marie Laveau, lies. This cemetery is said to be one of the most haunted places in the world, with reports of ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and even mysterious fires. Some say that Marie Laveau's spirit still roams the grounds, casting spells and protecting the city from harm. In another part of the world, the old Jewish cemetery in Prague is said to be the final resting place of over 100,000 bodies, with some graves dating back to the 15th century. Visitors have reported strange occurrences, from disembodied whispers to ghostly apparitions, and even sightings of the golem, a mythical creature said to roam the streets. One story, however, stands out above the rest, a tale that sends shivers down my spine even to this day. It's a story of a personal encounter, one that I'll never forget. I'd been exploring an old cemetery in the dead of night, camera gear in tow, when I stumbled upon a grave that seemed out of place. The headstone was old, weathered, and covered in moss, but it was the name that caught my attention, Emily. As I stood there, camera rolling, I felt an icy breeze sweep past me, and suddenly, I was face to face with a figure that I can only describe as Emily herself. She was pale, with sunken eyes and a mischievous grin. I tried to speak, but my voice was frozen in my throat. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. I was left standing there, shaken, with only my camera footage to prove that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. As we delve deeper into these spooky stories, a common theme emerges: our fascination with death and the unknown. It's a morbid curiosity that drives us to explore these haunted places, to uncover the secrets that lie within. And yet, despite the fear that grips us, we're drawn to these stories, like moths to a flame. That's all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed these spine-tingling stories from the depths of old cemeteries. If you have a spooky story of your own, be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you're looking for more haunted adventures, be sure to check out our other videos on haunted places and urban legends. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay spooky. Part 1: The Gate. There's something about the way iron gates cling to ancient cemeteries, their skeletal fingers latched onto crumbling brick walls, that always made my stomach turn. The cemetery by the old cathedral on the outskirts of town was no exception. I never wanted to go there. Not once in my 32 years had I set foot beyond those iron bars, not until that night. We were a small group of amateur ghost hunters, the kind of team that gets drunk off urban legends and spends weekends poking around dilapidated houses. There was Brad, who believed in every kind of spirit under the sun, Claire, who always carried a crucifix but laughed in the face of danger, and me, reluctantly dragged along on what they called Our biggest find yet. They'd heard about it online, whispers of a graveyard no one visited anymore, because those who didn't come back quite right. Not dead, though, Brad had insisted when I raised my concerns. People just say the ones who come out change. Change how? I had asked. Depends who you ask. Claire had shrugged, stuffing the crucifix into her coat pocket. The rain that evening was a slow, miserable drizzle, barely enough to wet the ground but plenty to make the air cold and uncomfortable. The fog rolled in around twilight, shrouding the looming shapes of trees and gravestones in a thick gray mist. And then there was the gate, rusted, leaning, its chains slack as if no one had bothered to lock it in years. This is it, Brad said, wide-eyed as he stared at the entrance. He reached forward to push it open. A screech split the night as the iron gate creaked on its hinges, loud enough to wake the dead. Stop, I muttered. The moment that gate swung open, I felt it, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I pulled my jacket tighter, suddenly aware of how silent it had become. The usual hum of distant cars or the rustle of wind was absent. The night itself had fallen deathly still. You're not backing out, are you? Claire teased, giving me a nudge. Come on. We've done worse. Something's off, I whispered, glancing around. The fog felt too thick, the shadows too deep. But I followed them in, if only because being outside the gate felt worse than being inside. The cemetery stretched out before us in a maze of graves. Rows of tombstones leaned at odd angles, some sunken halfway into the ground, others choked by overgrown weeds. The mist coiled around the trees, casting strange, shifting shadows. And yet, despite the decay, there was something beautiful about the place. The age of the tombstones, their weathered inscriptions barely legible, told of lives long forgotten. But this beauty didn't mask the gnawing unease that dug its claws into my chest. Hey, over here! Brad's voice echoed through the mist as he gestured toward a large crypt at the far end of the cemetery. I followed Claire, my feet crunching against the gravel path. I kept my eyes on the ground, avoiding the strange urge to look at the trees, those creaking, whispering trees that seemed to bend in our direction as we passed. Every now and then, I'd swear I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of something darting between the stones. But each time I looked, there was nothing. Brad had stopped in front of the crypt, wiping rain from his forehead as he set down his camera. The structure was ancient, moss-covered, and seemed to radiate a coldness far more intense than the rest of the cemetery. It's locked, Claire muttered, running her hand over the heavy stone door. We don't need to get inside, Brad said. We're just here to document the outside, see if we can capture anything on video. I didn't want to be near it, but I found myself rooted to the spot. There was something about the crypt, something pulling me toward it, making the air around me feel thick and suffocating. I felt my fingers twitch, almost as if they had a mind of their own, and I had to force myself to pull them away from the door. What is this place? I muttered, barely recognizing my own voice. Just another old tomb, Brad said, setting up his camera. But he was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. This place wasn't like the others. There was something alive beneath the surface, something waiting. And then we heard it. A soft scratching sound, like nails on stone, coming from inside the crypt. Part 2, the scratching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the scratching persisted, quiet, deliberate, and far too real for comfort. Brad, still fiddling with his camera, seemed oblivious to the sound. But Claire heard it. I saw her stiffen, her hands slipping into her coat pocket to grasp the crucifix. Her face went pale. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the eerie noise. The mist seemed to thicken, curling around us like cold fingers. Brad glanced up, finally noticing our expressions. What? What is it? Listen, Claire hissed, her eyes fixed on the crypt. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out. It wasn't the sound of rats or animals, it was purposeful, like fingers scraping against stone, dragging methodically in long, slow strokes. That could be anything, Brad said, his voice cracking slightly as he fumbled with his gear. Wind branches. It's coming from inside. I interrupted, my heart pounding. I took a step back from the crypt, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. We should leave. Before anyone could respond, there was a thud, a single, heavy blow from inside the crypt, like something pounding against the stone door. The sound reverberated through the air, and my entire body tensed. Claire's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. Her grip was iron. Brad, stop filming, she said, her voice low and shaking. We need to go. Now. But Brad wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the thrill, in the idea that we had stumbled upon something paranormal. Wait, he muttered, adjusting his camera to focus on the crypt. This is what we came here for. We need to document this. Thud. Another pounding from inside the crypt, this time louder. It wasn't subtle anymore. Whatever was in there wanted out. Claire tightened her grip on my arm, and I could feel her pulse racing through her fingers. Brad, I'm serious. We need to leave. Her eyes darted around the graveyard, scanning the fog-covered shadows for movement. She knew, just like I did, that we weren't alone. Brad, still caught up in his excitement, took a step closer to the crypt. He reached out, running his fingers along the stone surface, oblivious to the growing terror in the air. I opened my mouth to shout, to beg him to stop, but before I could, the scratching inside the crypt suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was unbearable. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine, colder than the night around us. The mist seemed to swirl more rapidly, the shadows deeper, darker. And then, in the silence, a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper at first, but unmistakable. A soft, pleading voice that seemed to seep through the cracks in the crypt's stone. Help me! I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Its tone was distorted, warped, as if it had been trapped there for centuries. The words were broken, desperate. Help me! Claire took another step back, her eyes wide with fear. Brad, we need to go! She hissed, pulling me with her. But Brad, wide-eyed and entranced, didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the crypt, as if he couldn't hear us anymore. I wanted to run, to tear my arm free from Claire's grasp and sprint back to the gate, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. The voice grew louder, the desperation more apparent. Help, please! I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the terror, or the strange pull the crypt had on me since we arrived, but I shouted. Who's there? For a moment, everything was still. The voice went silent, the fog stopped swirling, and the oppressive air seemed to lighten. Then the crypt door shuddered. It was small at first, just a vibration, but soon the stone slab began to tremble as if something was slamming against it from the other side, trying to break free. No! Claire screamed, her composure shattering as she turned to run. We have to leave! I was right behind her, but Brad didn't move. He stayed by the crypt, his hands still on the stone, eyes locked on whatever was beyond that door. Brad! I shouted, panic surging through me. Brad, we have to go! But it was too late. With a deafening crack, the door of the crypt shifted, dust and chunks of stone raining down as it began to open. Something dark and wet seeped from the gap, a thick, tar-like substance that glistened in the moonlight. The smell hit me next, rotten, decayed, like something long dead had been disturbed. Brad took a step closer, his hand trembling as he reached toward the widening gap. No! Claire screamed again, but this time, it wasn't a command, it was a plea. As the crypt door continued to open, something moved inside. Something long and thin, its shape distorted by the shadows. It slithered through the gap, almost snake-like, and reached toward Brad. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before it grabbed his arm. Brad's scream tore through the night, a horrible, guttural sound that echoed through the graveyard. He tried to pull away, but the thing inside the crypt, whatever it was, held him tight, dragging him closer to the door. I saw his face twist in pain, his eyes wide with terror, as he struggled against the thing pulling him in. "Brad!" I screamed, rushing forward to grab him, but Claire yanked me back just in time. The air grew heavy, and a sudden gust of wind knocked us both to the ground. And then, just like that, Brad was gone. The crypt doors slammed shut with a final, thunderous bang, the sound reverberating through the cemetery as we were left in stunned silence. Part 3: The Crypt's Hunger. For a moment, it didn't feel real. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the fog seemed to press in from all sides, cold and thick as it filled the space where Brad had stood just moments before. Claire was still gripping my arm, her nails digging into my skin as if she needed the pain to remind herself this wasn't a nightmare. I could feel her trembling. "Brad," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. He was gone, taken by whatever lived in that crypt. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there wasn't one. Nothing natural could explain the thing that had reached out and pulled him in. "We need to get help," Claire muttered, panic edging into her voice. She stumbled to her feet, dragging me up with her. "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, my mind blank, running on instinct alone. I wasn't thinking about what had just happened. I couldn't. If I thought about Brad, about that thing inside the crypt, I'd freeze. I'd lose it completely. So I focused on the only thing that made sense: we had to leave. We turned toward the gate, still open and barely visible through the fog. It felt miles away, but we started running anyway, our footsteps loud in the eerie silence. Each step felt heavier, as if the cemetery itself didn't want us to leave. Behind us, the crypt was silent. No more scratching, no more voices. But I could feel something watching. The air had thickened, suffused with a sickening, predatory tension that made every hair on my body stand on end. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, many eyes, hidden somewhere in the mist, watching us. "Faster!" Claire gasped, pulling me along as her pace quickened. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I forced myself to keep up with her. The gate loomed ahead, rusted and crooked, our only chance at escape. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second. I wish I hadn't. There, emerging from the fog behind the crypt, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, moving between the gravestones, their shapes barely distinguishable through the mist. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their forms were gaunt, twisted, and wrong. I could make out the hollow sockets where their eyes should have been, the decayed flesh hanging from their bones. They were watching us, waiting, their faces contorted into expressions of hunger. One of them moved closer, gliding over the ground like it wasn't even touching it, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. A deep, primal fear took hold of me. Whatever these things were, they weren't alive. And whatever they wanted, they were going to take it. "Don't look back!" Claire's voice snapped me out of it. She hadn't seen them yet, thank God. If she had, I wasn't sure she'd be able to keep running. I faced forward again, my heart hammering in my chest, the gate just a few steps away now. I could see the road beyond, the flicker of distant streetlights, the safety that waited just outside the cemetery's cursed grounds. But then Claire stopped. She halted so suddenly that I crashed into her, both of us stumbling to the ground. I cursed, pushing myself up, my hands shaking. "Claire! What the hell are you doing?" She wasn't moving. She just stood there, staring at something ahead of us. Something at the gate. Slowly, I followed her gaze. There, standing just beyond the cemetery's iron threshold, was Brad. At least, it looked like Brad. But I knew deep down that it wasn't him. His clothes were the same, ripped and dirt-stained, but his face was wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were pitch black, reflecting no light, just endless voids. He stood unnaturally still, as if he were a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. "Brad." Claire's voice was small, almost childlike. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand trembling. "No!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "That's not him! Claire, that's not Brad!" But she wasn't listening. I could see it in her face, the hope, the desperate, foolish hope that somehow, someway, Brad had escaped whatever had taken him. That he was standing there, waiting for us. "He's right there," she whispered, her voice quivering with disbelief. "He's alive, No!" I pulled her harder, yanking her away from the gate, my voice breaking. "That's not Brad. Don't you see? He's dead, Claire. He's—" And then Brad moved. His head snapped to the side with an unnatural jerk, his mouth opening wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to. His lips stretched back, splitting as they revealed rows of jagged, rotting teeth. His eyes, those black, soulless eyes, bored into us, into me. And he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was wrong, too wide, too full of malice. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my throat as I clutched Claire's arm like a lifeline. "Run!" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. "Run!" I screamed this time, shoving Claire toward the road. She snapped out of her trance, her eyes wide with horror, as she finally saw what I had been seeing all along. We bolted toward the gate, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The figures in the cemetery were closing in, their twisted forms creeping closer with every passing second. I could feel them behind me, just a breath away, reaching for me. We reached the gate. I could see the pavement, the road, the world beyond the cemetery that suddenly seemed so far away. But as we stepped through the threshold, the gate slammed shut behind us with a thunderous clang. I didn't look back. Not until we were halfway down the road, panting, gasping for air, the cold night wind biting at our faces. Only then did I dare to turn. The cemetery was silent once again, the fog thick and unmoving. But there, just beyond the gate, I saw them. The figures. And Brad standing among them, his black eyes watching us as we fled into the night. Part 4, The Town's Secret. We didn't stop running until we were well beyond the cemetery, out of the fog's grip and into the town's dimly lit streets. My lungs burned with each breath, the cold night air cutting into my throat like shards of glass. Claire, her face pale and streaked with tears, staggered beside me, clutching her side as if trying to hold herself together. We finally collapsed onto a park bench under the feeble glow of a flickering streetlight. For a long moment, we didn't speak, didn't even move. We just sat there, trembling, the terror still clinging to our skin like a second layer of clothing. It was too much to process. What we had seen, what we had left behind, it wasn't just something we could explain away. Brad was gone. And whatever we saw back there, whatever was wearing his face, wasn't human anymore. Claire broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a whisper. What the hell was that?" Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated as if she couldn't unsee what had just happened. I shook my head, my mouth dry. "I don't know. I don't." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the full truth. Something had happened inside that cemetery, something more than just supernatural. And I had a sinking feeling the town we lived in, this quiet, unassuming place, knew far more than it let on. We were both silent again, staring at the empty streets around us, half expecting those twisted figures to come lurching out of the darkness. But there was only the wind, howling low and mournful as it passed between the buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotting, something wrong. "We need to tell someone," Claire whispered. "We need to go to the police, or somebody. They need to know what happened. What if it's still out there?" Her voice cracked, and she hugged herself, shivering. I glanced around the empty streets, the rows of houses with their dark windows, and something inside me recoiled at the thought of involving anyone else. Who would believe us? What would we even say? That a crypt came to life and swallowed our friend whole? That figures from the graveyard had risen from their graves to chase us? No one would believe us. And worse, what if we were putting others in danger? I reached over, grabbing Claire's shaking hand. "I don't think the police can help with this," I said, my voice flat. "We need answers first. We need to find out what the hell that place is." Her eyes flickered with doubt, but after a long moment she nodded. "But how? We can't just go back there." No, I agreed. But someone has to know. Someone in this town. We've lived here our whole lives, and I've never heard a single thing about that cemetery. There has to be a reason for that. Claire's eyes narrowed. You think the town is hiding something? I thought back to the figures I'd seen moving between the gravestones. The twisted faces, the empty eyes. And Brad, no, not Brad, not anymore, smiling that awful, too wide grin at us. I thought about how old the cemetery had looked, how forgotten. No one had visited that place in years. And yet, it was still there, waiting. Yeah, I muttered. I do. We sat there for a while longer, the streetlight above us flickering on and off, casting strange shadows on the pavement. The town felt different now, as though we had peeled back a layer and seen something we weren't supposed to. Something rotten beneath the surface. Eventually, Claire stood up, wiping her eyes. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. Where do we start? I thought for a moment, running through the names of the town's residents in my mind. Who could we ask? Who would know about the cemetery? And then an idea hit me. There's someone, I said slowly, standing up beside her. Mrs. Garrison. She's lived here her whole life, over 90 years. If anyone knows anything about that place, it's her. Mrs. Garrison was a relic of the town's past. She lived in a crumbling old house at the end of Oak Street, surrounded by overgrown hedges and trees that blotted out the sun. She didn't leave her house much anymore, but every now and then, we'd see her sitting on her porch, watching the world go by with those sharp, knowing eyes. She's always seemed off, Claire murmured, biting her lip. You really think she knows something? If she doesn't, I said, then no one does. We set off toward her house, the weight of the night's horrors still pressing down on us. The streets were unnervingly quiet, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to make a wrong move. When we reached Mrs. Garrison's house, the porch light was on, casting a dim, yellow glow over the steps. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, but I could see a faint flicker of light from somewhere inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the old brass knocker. Was this a mistake? Should we really be dragging an old woman into this? But before I could second-guess myself, the door creaked open. Mrs. Garrison stood there, her thin frame silhouetted by the light from a single lamp behind her. She was smaller than I remembered, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes, those sharp, blue eyes, were as piercing as ever. I've been expecting you, she said, her voice raspy but steady. Claire and I exchanged a quick glance, both of us startled by her words. I'd opened my mouth to speak, but Mrs. Garrison stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. Come in, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. You've seen it, haven't you? The crypt. A cold shiver ran down my spine. How could she possibly know? We stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind us. The house was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and the smell of dust. Shadows clung to every corner, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. Mrs. Garrison led us to a small sitting room, where the single lamp cast a pool of yellow light over a threadbare couch. She lowered herself into a chair, her bony hands gripping the armrests tightly. I warned them, she muttered, mostly to herself. I told them it would come back. But they didn't listen. No one ever listens. Mrs. Garrison, I said, sitting on the edge of the couch, my voice shaky. We saw something tonight. At the cemetery. It took our friend. Her eyes flicked to mine, and I saw a flash of something, fear, or maybe regret, flicker in their depths. It doesn't take them, she whispered. Not really. It changes them. Claire shifted uncomfortably beside me. What do you mean? What's in that crypt? Mrs. Garrison was silent for a long moment, her gaze far away, as if she were reliving some distant memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. It's not just a crypt, she said. It's a doorway. A doorway to something that shouldn't be here. Something old, something hungry. And once it has a taste. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It will never stop. Part 5: The Doorway. Mrs. Garrison's words hung in the air like a heavy mist, sinking into my skin. I couldn't shake the cold terror that followed every syllable. A doorway to something hungry? What the hell had we stumbled into? Claire, sitting beside me, leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of the couch. What do you mean, it's a doorway? A doorway to where? Mrs. Garrison's eyes didn't leave mine, her voice steady and unflinching. Not where, child. What? The way she said it sent an ice-cold shiver through me, a deep, primal fear rising in my gut. I wanted to press her for details, but part of me wasn't sure I could handle the answer. Still, we needed to know. Brad, whatever he had become, wasn't the first victim of this place. And if we didn't find a way to stop it, he wouldn't be the last. I swallowed hard, pushing down the lump of fear in my throat. What's on the other side of that crypt? What's coming through? Mrs. Garrison leaned back in her chair, her bony hands gripping the armrests. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, like every word she spoke drained more life from her. It's not easy to explain. The thing in that crypt, it's old, far older than you or me, or even this town. It doesn't belong here. Her voice lowered to a whisper, and we had to lean in closer to catch her words. This place, this town, it wasn't always cursed. It was once a good place, peaceful, like any other. But the men who built it, they made a terrible mistake. They built the cemetery on sacred ground, land that wasn't theirs to claim. And they disturbed something. Something that had been buried for a reason. Claire shifted uncomfortably. What did they disturb? Mrs. Garrison's eyes darkened. A spirit. A powerful one. The kind that doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. It's been trapped there, locked behind that door for centuries, waiting for someone foolish enough to open it. Is that what happened? I asked, my voice shaking. Did someone open the crypt? She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Not just someone. Many have tried. Over the years, there have been incidents. People lured in by the promise of power, of wealth, or simply by curiosity. The crypt calls to them, you see. It whispers. It makes promises. And once it has them, it's too late. I shuddered, thinking of the voice we'd heard, pleading, desperate, asking for help. Was that it? Was that the trap that lured people in? Claire's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. What about Brad? Is there a way to get him back? To undo what's been done? Mrs. Garrison's expression softened for the briefest moment, but then she shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. He's already gone, child. What you saw, that wasn't your friend anymore. The moment he was taken, he became part of it. Part of the hunger. My heart sank. I didn't want to believe her, but I'd seen it with my own eyes. Brad wasn't Brad anymore. The thing that had smiled at us from the gate, it had worn his face, but it wasn't him. There has to be a way to stop it, I said, more desperate now. We can't just leave it there. What if it happens again? What if it comes from more people? Mrs. Garrison looked up at me, her expression grim. You can't stop it. The only thing you can do is keep it contained. Keep it locked away. That's what the crypt was for, you see. It's not just a grave, it's a prison. And as long as the door stays shut, it can't break free. But it's not shut, Claire exclaimed, panic rising in her voice. It opened tonight, we saw it. If it's a prison, why would it open? Mrs. Garrison sighed, a weary, defeated sound. Because it's been weakening. The wards that kept it sealed have been fading for years. Too much death, too much curiosity. People like your friend Brad, who get too close. Each one that falls to it weakens the barrier a little more. She paused, her eyes flicking to the window, as if expecting to see something watching us from the shadows outside. I've been trying to keep it sealed, to maintain what's left of the protection, but I'm old now. I'm not as strong as I used to be. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. If she couldn't keep it contained, if the crypt was already starting to open, how long before the thing inside broke free completely? What happens when it gets out? I asked, dreading the answer. Her gaze darkened further, and when she spoke, her voice was hollow. It will consume everything. The town, the people, the very land itself. It will devour it all, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Claire let out a soft gasp, her hands trembling in her lap. I felt the blood drain from my face, the enormity of what we were facing sinking in like ice in my veins. There has to be something we can do, I said, my voice shaking but determined. We can't just sit here and wait for it to destroy everything. Mrs. Garrison watched me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. There might be one way. But it's dangerous. And it will require more strength than I have left. I leaned forward, desperate for any kind of hope. What is it? We'll do whatever it takes. She studied us both for a moment, then spoke slowly, carefully. The crypt is a prison, yes, but it was built on a place of power, a gateway between this world and the one beyond. The thing inside, it wasn't born here. It came through that gateway. If you want to stop it, you'll need to close the gate. For good. How? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Garrison's gaze sharpened. There's an old ritual. It hasn't been done in over a century, but it's the only way to permanently seal the gateway. But be warned, it's not a simple task. The crypt will fight back. It will try to stop you. And if you fail... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences were clear. I swallowed hard, glancing at Claire. She looked terrified, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. She nodded slowly, meeting my gaze. We don't have a choice, I said, turning back to Mrs. Garrison. Tell us what we need to do. She hesitated for a moment, then rose from her chair with a tired groan, motioning for us to follow her. I'll show you. But be warned, once you start, there's no turning back. And you'll need to be prepared for what comes next. As we followed her down the dark, narrow hallway, a single thought echoed in my mind: this is our only chance. If we don't stop it now, it will never stop. Part 6. The Ritual. Mrs. Garrison led us down a narrow corridor to the back of her house, where the air grew colder and the shadows deeper. The walls here were lined with shelves crammed with old books, strange trinkets, and jars of unidentifiable things. It was like stepping into another time, a place where the weight of history pressed down on you from all sides. We followed her into a small room, barely large enough to fit the three of us, where a low wooden table sat in the center. On it, a dusty, leather-bound book lay open, its yellowed pages covered in dense, spidery handwriting. Candles, half-burned and surrounded by wax drippings, sat on each corner of the table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. This is it, Mrs. Garrison said softly, her voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. The ritual that will seal the gateway for good. But it's not easy. And it's not safe. I glanced at Claire, who looked pale and shaken but nodded in determination. There was no other way. We had to do this. Mrs. Garrison took a deep breath and motioned for us to sit. Listen carefully. There's no room for error. Once the ritual begins, the crypt will fight back. It will do everything in its power to stop you from completing the seal. You must stay strong, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear. Do you understand? We both nodded, though I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse quickening with fear. Mrs. Garrison turned the brittle pages of the book with reverence, revealing a series of strange symbols and incantations. The ritual requires 3 things: an offering, an incantation, and the blood of the living. The offering must be something personal, something that binds you to this place. It will serve as the anchor to close the gate. Claire swallowed hard. What kind of offering? Mrs. Garrison's gaze turned somber. Something that has meaning to you. Something that connects you to the one you've lost, to your friend. His spirit still lingers, trapped between this world and the next. If we're to close the gate, you must sever that connection. My stomach dropped at the thought. Brad. His name rang in my ears, a painful reminder that we had failed him. And now, somehow, we had to break the last thread that tied him to us. But I knew I had to do it. There was no other way. I'll do it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'll make the offering. Mrs. Garrison nodded and handed me a small, rusted dagger. You'll need this. The blood of the living must be spilled, just enough to draw the sigil on the crypt's door. Once the symbol is complete, you'll speak the incantation. Claire's face drained of color as she eyed the dagger, but she didn't say anything. I could tell she was barely holding it together. I wasn't sure how much more of this either of us could take, but we had come too far to turn back now. Mrs. Garrison handed us a small pouch, tied shut with a piece of twine. Inside this is the incense you'll need to burn at the crypt. It will draw the entity's attention, keep it focused on you long enough for the ritual to take effect. But be warned, once it knows you're trying to seal it away, it will stop at nothing to prevent you from finishing. I nodded, feeling the weight of the dagger in my hand. What happens if we don't finish in time? Mrs. Garrison's face darkened. Then the crypt will open fully, and everything inside will come through. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't need to ask what that meant. I could already picture the twisted, decayed figures we had seen lurking in the mist, waiting for their chance to break free. Claire took a shaky breath, her voice barely steady. What about the incantation? What do we say? Mrs. Garrison pointed to a passage in the book, a line written in a language I didn't recognize. You'll need to speak this aloud, once the sigil is drawn. It will invoke the power of the seal, forcing the gate shut. But be careful. The words hold power, and if spoken incorrectly, they could weaken the barrier instead. I glanced at the strange symbols, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. It didn't make sense, but then again, none of this did. We were dealing with forces far beyond anything I could comprehend, and the only thing keeping us going was the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, we could stop it. Mrs. Garrison lit the candles around the table, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. There's no time to waste. You must go back to the cemetery, to the crypt. Everything you need is here, she said, gesturing to the pouch and the book. Once you start, you can't stop. Do you understand? We nodded, though the weight of what we were about to do felt like a crushing force on my chest. My heart raced as I took the pouch and the book, slipping them into my bag. The dagger felt cold in my hand, its blade sharp and rusted with age. Mrs. Garrison reached out and touched my arm, her eyes full of a sorrow I hadn't seen before. Be careful, child. The crypt has claimed many before you. Don't let it take you too. We stood, the tension between us thick and heavy. Claire looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a flicker of resolve there, too. We had no choice. If we didn't do this, the town, everything we knew, would be swallowed whole by whatever was inside that crypt. Let's go, I whispered. The walk back to the cemetery was slow, our footsteps heavy with dread. The mist seemed thicker now, swirling around us as we made our way through the dark streets. The weight of the ritual pressed down on my shoulders like a physical force. We didn't speak, but I could feel Claire's fear in the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something to leap out of the fog and drag her back into the darkness. The cemetery was just ahead, the rusted gate looming in the distance like the mouth of some ancient, hungry beast. I paused, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to run as far away from that place as I could. But I couldn't. We stepped through the gate, the air immediately colder, the fog thicker. The rows of gravestones seemed to shift in the darkness, twisting into strange, distorted shapes as we made our way to the crypt. It stood at the far end of the cemetery, its stone door looming like a sentinel, waiting. Claire stopped just a few feet from the crypt, her breathing shallow. Are you sure about this? She whispered. No, I admitted, my voice shaking. But we don't have a choice. We approached the crypt slowly, the shadows around us feeling too close, too alive. The air grew heavier, pressing down on us with each step. And then, just as we reached the stone door, the scratching began again. It was faint at first, like the sound of nails dragging across stone. But it grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was clawing its way out. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from sheer terror. "Get the incense," I whispered to Claire, my hands trembling as I pulled out the book and the dagger. She nodded, fumbling with the pouch, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then, just as before, a voice, twisted and broken, echoed from within the crypt. "Help me!" I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to focus. The words from the book swam in front of my eyes, but I pushed through, the weight of the dagger heavy in my hand. I drew a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. We had to do this, or we would lose everything. Part 7. The Crypt Awakens. The voice, twisted, desperate, kept echoing from within the crypt, sending cold shivers down my spine. It was the same plea we'd heard before. Only now, standing at the stone door with the ritual tools in hand, I could feel the pull of it, like it was trying to seep into my mind. It wasn't just a voice, it was something else, something darker, worming its way into my thoughts, trying to convince me to open the door. "Don't listen to it," Claire whispered, her voice trembling as she fumbled with the incense. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, but there was a fierce determination in her expression. She wouldn't let this thing take us, not after what it had done to Brad. I nodded, swallowing hard. I had to focus. I couldn't let that voice crawl under my skin. The crypt would do everything it could to stop us. That's what Mrs. Garrison had warned. This was just the beginning. I knelt in front of the door, the ancient stone looming over me like a gravestone marking my own impending death. With shaky hands, I unsheathed the dagger and stared at the dull blade. It was rusted, old, like it had seen too many deaths, like it had been used for too many rituals. I pressed the tip of the blade to my palm, wincing as it broke the skin. Blood welled up, crimson drops sliding down the edge of the dagger. The sound from within the crypt grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just scratching anymore, there was something else now. The scrape of stone, the sound of movement, something was in there, trying to push the door open. I could feel the vibration beneath my feet, a slow, rumbling pressure building as the entity inside fought against the seal. "Help me!" The voice again, but now it wasn't pleading. It was mocking. I could hear it shift, twisting into something crueler, darker. "You can't stop me. You're too weak." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to ignore the words. Claire knelt beside me, lighting the incense with shaking hands. The sweet, acrid scent filled the air, mingling with the dampness of the fog. It drifted in lazy spirals, hanging like a veil between us and the crypt. The voice hissed in response, almost like it could feel the ritual beginning. "What now?" Claire whispered, her eyes darting to me. I looked down at the ancient book, its brittle pages fluttering in the breeze. The incantation. That was next. I wiped the blood from my hand and began tracing the sigil on the stone door, my heart pounding as I followed the ancient lines. Each stroke felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was thickening around me, resisting every movement. It was as if the crypt knew what I was doing, and it didn't want to be sealed. As I completed the last mark, the ground beneath us trembled. A low, deep rumble, like something shifting far below, echoed through the cemetery. Claire's eyes darted around, fear etched into every line of her face. I stood, the dagger still in my hand, and met her gaze. "Now we say the words." The incantation. I had memorized it, repeating it in my head over and over, though it was written in a language I didn't recognize. But as I stared at the symbols in the book, something about them began to blur. The letters swam before my eyes, shifting, changing. "Do it!" Claire urged, her voice trembling with panic. She could feel it too, the crypt wasn't going to wait much longer. I opened my mouth to speak, but as soon as the first word left my lips, the door slammed. It shook violently, and the entire crypt groaned under the pressure. I stumbled backward, clutching the dagger tighter. "No!" The voice screamed now, no longer pleading. You can't stop me! I'm already here! The voice didn't sound human anymore. Its tone was guttural, distorted, like it was speaking through layers of decayed flesh. The stone door cracked. A jagged line split down the center, dust and debris falling from its edges. Something black, oozing and foul, seeped through the crack. It wasn't liquid, not exactly. It was more like shadow given form, twisting and writhing as it pushed against the door, trying to escape. Claire screamed, stumbling back as the darkness reached for us. Say it! Now! I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking as I recited the incantation. The words felt foreign, wrong, as if my tongue wasn't meant to shape them. But I pressed on, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows hissed, retreating slightly as the first few words left my mouth. But the pressure didn't stop. The crypt was fighting harder now, the ground beneath us trembling as if the earth itself was trying to break free. I shouted the last word of the incantation, the force of it tearing from my throat. For a moment, everything went still. And then the world exploded. A deafening boom shook the ground as the stone door of the crypt shattered, spraying debris in all directions. The black ooze poured out now, thicker and faster, spilling across the ground like a tide of ink. The smell hit me next, rotten, decayed, like 1,000 corpses left to fester in the sun. But that wasn't the worst part. Through the blackened mass it rose. The thing that had been sealed inside the crypt for centuries, hidden away from the world. Its form was vague, shifting, human, but not human. Its body was twisted, too long, its limbs too thin, with joints that bent at impossible angles. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void, a gaping blackness that seemed to pull at the air around it. It moved toward us, slow at first, but with a kind of horrifying grace, as if it had waited for this moment for centuries and was savoring every second. No, 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 no! Claire whimpered beside me, stumbling backward, her eyes wide with terror. I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The thing's presence was like a weight pressing down on me, its very existence warping the space around it. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out all sound but the rush of my own blood. The dagger felt useless in my hand, tiny, insignificant, like a toy against the enormity of the thing we had unleashed. I told you! The voice whispered, though now it came from everywhere at once. You can't stop me. You're too late. The shadow surged forward, and in a split second, the world went dark. The fog closed in around us, the blackness swallowing everything. I could hear Claire's screams, distant now, echoing as if from another world. And then, just as suddenly, the ground beneath us opened. I fell. Not in the way someone trips or stumbles. I fell into the earth, into a void that stretched on forever. The cemetery, the crypt, even the sky above, all of it vanished as I plunged into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. Everything was black, my ears ringing from the impact. I lay there, gasping, my body trembling as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The crypt, the thing inside, it had swallowed us. Claire! I screamed, panic flooding my chest. But there was no answer. Only silence. I pushed myself to my feet, swaying as the world tilted around me. I couldn't see anything, not the cemetery, not Claire, not even the ground beneath my feet. It was like I had been dropped into a void, a place that didn't exist. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. It was coming for me. Part 8. The Void. The footsteps echoed in the dark, heavy and deliberate, growing closer with every second. I strained to see through the pitch-black void, but there was nothing, no shapes, no outlines, just endless emptiness. My breath quickened, panic rising like bile in my throat. Claire was gone. Brad was gone. And I was next. I spun around, trying to orient myself, but there was no direction to the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling the vast emptiness around me. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but I couldn't see it. My heart pounded as I clutched the dagger tighter, though I knew it was useless against whatever was coming. I screamed for Claire again, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Claire! Where are you?" But there was no response. Only the footsteps, drawing closer, more distinct. It sounded like bare feet slapping against wet stone, as if something heavy was dragging itself toward me. A low, guttural breathing accompanied the sound, like whatever it was exerting itself just by existing. I staggered backward, my hands shaking as I brandished the dagger in front of me, hoping against hope that it would somehow protect me. But I couldn't stop the fear from clawing at my mind. The crypt, the ritual, none of it had worked. We had failed. I had failed. And now, something was coming to claim me. "Who are you?" I shouted into the void, my voice breaking. "What do you want?" The footsteps paused for a moment, and then a low, deep chuckle echoed through the darkness. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, like the rasp of bone on stone, like the last breath of something that had been dead for centuries. The air around me seemed to thicken, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of its presence. "You already know what I am," the voice said, slithering through the darkness. "I have waited, for so long." The voice was ancient, distorted, and yet it felt familiar, as if it had been whispering in my ear my whole life, just out of reach. It was the same voice that had called to us from the crypt, the same one that had pulled Brad into the darkness. I gritted my teeth, trying to hold on to what little courage I had left. You were trapped. You can't get out." Another low chuckle, closer now. "You think I was trapped? I have always been here. In the dark. Waiting. You are the ones who came to me." My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps resumed, heavier this time, faster. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, like something massive was moving just below the surface. I had to move. I couldn't just stand here and wait for it to catch me. But where could I go? There was no escape, no path, no light to guide me. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint glow, barely perceptible through the blackness. It flickered like a dying ember, but it was something, a point of light in the vast, oppressive dark. I didn't think. I just ran. The footsteps behind me quickened, the sound of something massive pursuing me in the void. My feet pounded against the invisible ground, my lungs burning as I sprinted toward the faint glow. Every step felt like it was taking more effort, as if the darkness itself was trying to pull me down, drag me back into its cold embrace. The voice followed me, echoing through the void, teasing, mocking. "You can't run from me. You're already mine." I ignored it, pushing myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. The light grew brighter, though it was still distant, like a lone star in an endless night. I didn't know what it was, didn't know if it would save me or if it was just another trick, but it was the only chance I had. Behind me, the sound of pursuit grew louder. I could hear the scrape of claws on stone, the rasping breath of something not quite alive. It was close, too close, and my heart pounded in terror. I could feel the darkness pressing in around me, thick and suffocating, like it was trying to consume me whole. And then I heard something else, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Becca!" "Claire!" My heart leaped in my chest, and I pushed myself harder, the light ahead of me growing brighter now, more defined. I could see the outline of a figure standing in the glow, waving frantically. "Claire!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. But before I could reach her, something lashed out from the darkness. A cold, wet tendril wrapped around my ankle, yanking me to the ground. I hit the invisible floor with a grunt, the air knocked from my lungs. The dagger slipped from my hand, clattering somewhere in the darkness. The tendril tightened around my leg, pulling me backward, dragging me away from the light. I screamed, clawing at the ground, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. The darkness was pulling me in, dragging me down. "Help me!" I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. Claire's silhouette rushed toward me, the light she carried casting long, eerie shadows across the void. She reached out, her hand grasping mine just as the tendril tightened its grip around my leg, pulling me harder. For a moment I thought I would be torn in two, the pull of the darkness was so strong, so relentless. But Claire held on. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice filled with fear and determination. "Don't let it take you!" I gritted my teeth, fighting against the pull with every ounce of strength I had left. My fingers slipped in her grip, and I felt the darkness pulling harder, but I refused to let go. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I would be lost forever. With a final, desperate scream, Claire yanked me free. The tendril snapped back into the darkness, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling from the effort. Claire knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she helped me to my feet. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice urgent. "It's not done with us yet." I nodded, my legs barely able to support my weight as we stumbled toward the light. The glow grew brighter with every step, the darkness receding as we approached. And then, finally, we reached it. It wasn't a star, or a lantern, or anything else I had expected. It was the crypt door. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart sinking. The stone door loomed in front of us, exactly as it had before, cracked, ancient, but still standing. But now, instead of being shrouded in mist and fog, it was surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the void. There was no escape. We were right back where we started. "We can't stay here," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "It'll come back." I stared at the door, my mind racing. The ritual. We had to finish the ritual. Mrs. Garrison had said the crypt was a doorway, a gateway. But we hadn't closed it. Not fully. I looked down at the ground, searching for the dagger, and there it was, lying just a few feet away, glinting in the faint light. I rushed over and picked it up, my hands still trembling. "We have to finish it," I said, turning to Claire. "The ritual, we have to seal the crypt." Her eyes widened in fear. "But we already—" "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "We didn't finish. That's why it's still here. That's why it's still after us." The ground beneath us trembled again, the same low rumble that had preceded the crypt's last eruption. We didn't have much time. "Draw the sigil," I ordered, thrusting the dagger into Claire's hands. "I'll say the incantation." She hesitated for a moment, fear etched into her features, but then she nodded and knelt in front of the door, carving the sigil into the stone with the tip of the dagger. Blood oozed from her fingers as she worked, the sharp scent of iron filling the air. I opened the book, my heart racing as I found the passage. The words blurred before my eyes again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. I started reciting the incantation, my voice strong and steady, forcing the ancient syllables from my lips. The ground shook harder, the darkness closing in around us. The crypt door groaned, the tendrils of blackness reaching out once again. But this time, I didn't stop. The air grew thick, oppressive, the weight of the entity pressing down on us as it fought to break free. But the sigil glowed brighter now, pulsing with an otherworldly light. Claire worked faster, her hands slick with blood, as the final strokes of the symbol took shape. And then, as I shouted the last word of the incantation, the crypt door slammed shut. A deafening roar filled the air, the sound of something ancient and furious being ripped away from this world. The darkness recoiled, pulling back, shrinking into itself. The ground beneath us stilled, and for a moment, everything was silent. We stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the crypt door. It was sealed. The gateway was closed. But the darkness wasn't gone. It lingered, just beyond the edges of the light, watching. Waiting. Part 9: The Watchers. We stood in front of the crypt, the thick, suffocating darkness hovering just beyond our reach, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My legs were trembling, my body exhausted from the ritual. Claire was slumped beside me, her hands stained with blood from carving the sigil. The crypt door was shut now, sealed, for all we knew, but the air around us still felt wrong, heavy, like we had only postponed something inevitable. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was our labored breathing, filling the stillness. Then, Claire broke the silence, her voice shaking. Is it over?" I glanced at the crypt door, my heart still pounding in my chest. The glow from the sigil was faint now, almost as if the light had been swallowed by the black void surrounding us. I wanted to believe it was over, that we had done what we came to do, that we had stopped whatever was inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I think we closed the gate, but… Claire's eyes followed mine, her gaze fixed on the darkness that surrounded us. It wasn't just the crypt anymore. There was something out there, beyond the edges of the light, hidden in the void. I could feel it. I knew she could feel it too. We need to leave, she said, her voice tight with fear. We have to get out of here. I nodded, my legs feeling weak beneath me. But as I turned to walk away from the crypt, something stopped me. The fog, which had been swirling around the cemetery, was gone. Instead, the darkness stretched out like an endless sea, consuming everything in its path. The gravestones had disappeared, swallowed by the blackness. Even the sky above was gone, replaced by a thick, oppressive void that seemed to press down on us from all sides. There was no way out. No path back. We're trapped, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Claire's eyes widened in panic. No, we can't be. But her voice trailed off as she saw it, too. The cemetery was gone. There was nothing left but the crypt and the endless, encroaching dark. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of panic in my chest. We had to think. There had to be a way out. We couldn't have come this far, only to be trapped here forever. We need to find something, I muttered, scanning the darkness for any sign of a break in the void, any sign of the gate that had brought us here. Maybe if we… A low whisper cut through the air, freezing me in place. At first, I thought it was the voice from the crypt again, the same, distorted voice that had begged for help, that had taunted us. But this was different. It wasn't coming from the crypt. It was coming from everywhere. I turned, my heart pounding as the whispers grew louder. They were faint at first, like wind through the trees, but as the moments passed, they became clearer, more insistent. Words. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a language that made my skin crawl. They're here, Claire whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Oh God, they're here. I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold. In the darkness beyond the crypt, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. Their shapes were vague at first, just shadows in the void, but as they moved closer, I could see them more clearly. They were human, or they had been once, but their forms were twisted, unnatural. Their skin was pale, stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollow, empty. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their heads tilting at unnatural angles as they watched us. The Watchers. I didn't know how I knew that's what they were, but the name echoed in my mind, whispered from some dark corner of my memory. They had been there all along, waiting just outside our perception, watching, waiting for their moment. Run! I whispered to Claire, my voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers. But there was nowhere to run. The Watchers moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their mouths moving in silent whispers. They weren't walking, they were gliding, their feet barely touching the ground as they moved. There was no escape. They had surrounded us. Claire grabbed my arm, her grip tight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What do we do? She whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The dagger in my hand felt useless now, a tiny, insignificant weapon against the overwhelming presence of the Watchers. I had thought the crypt was the source of our terror, the thing we needed to stop. But now I realized, they were the true danger. The crypt had been their prison, their cage. And we had disturbed it. We have to move, I muttered, pulling Claire with me as we backed away from the approaching figures. We can't stay here. But as we moved, so did they. Their heads tilted in unison, their hollow eyes following our every step. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a thick, oppressive sound that seemed to come from inside my own head. It was like they were speaking directly to me, their voices crawling into my mind, twisting my thoughts. They're going to take us, Claire whimpered, her voice breaking. "Oh God, they're going to take us like they took Brad." I squeezed her arm, trying to keep her grounded, though my own fear was threatening to tear me apart. "No, we can't let them. We have to keep moving. We have to." Before I could finish, one of the watchers broke from the circle. It moved faster now, gliding toward us with a terrifying speed. Its face was pale and gaunt, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Its eyes, empty black holes, bored into mine as it closed the distance. "Don't look at it!" I screamed, pulling Claire behind me, raising the dagger in a desperate attempt to ward it off. But the watcher didn't stop. It came closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward me, its whispers growing louder, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. I swung the dagger, the blade cutting through the air with a sharp hiss. But it didn't make contact. The watcher moved faster than I could react, its body twisting in impossible ways as it dodged the blade. And then, before I could raise it again, its hand was on my wrist. A cold, searing pain shot through my arm as the watcher's fingers dug into my skin, its touch like ice, burning and freezing all at once. My vision blurred, the darkness around me closing in. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until they were all I could hear. I felt myself slipping, my mind unraveling as the watcher's grip tightened. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the cacophony of whispers. I could feel it pulling me in, pulling me down into the dark, into the void where there was no escape, no light. But then, through the fog of terror, I heard Claire's voice. "Let her go!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. I blinked, my vision clearing just enough to see Claire lunge at the watcher, the dagger in her hand flashing in the dim light. She drove it into the creature's chest with all her strength, the blade sinking into its pale, twisted flesh. The watcher let out a shriek, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that pierced the air, and released its grip on me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I watched the creature writhe in agony. The dagger was still lodged in its chest, black, oily blood oozing from the wound. But it wasn't dead. With a terrifying speed, the watcher yanked the dagger from its chest and tossed it aside, its hollow eyes fixing on Claire now. It moved toward her, its long, twisted fingers reaching for her throat. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward, but I was too slow. The watcher's hand closed around Claire's neck, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. Her eyes widened in terror, her hands clawing at the creature's arm as she gasped for air. And then the whispers grew louder. The other watchers moved in, their empty eyes watching as Claire struggled, their mouths moving in silent, mocking whispers. They were going to take her. And there was nothing I could do to stop them. Part 10, The Final Gate. Claire's choking gasps echoed in my ears, her feet kicking uselessly in the air as the watcher lifted her higher. My legs moved on instinct, but each step felt like wading through thick mud, the air heavy with the weight of the other watchers closing in. Their whispers drummed inside my skull, relentless, twisting my thoughts, turning them against me. I had failed her. Claire's eyes met mine, wide, terrified, and desperate. She reached out with one trembling hand as if begging me to save her, but the watcher's grip tightened, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Her skin was turning pale, the life draining from her body. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped, suffocated by the whispers. I was paralyzed by the horror of it all. We were out of options. The crypt was sealed, but it hadn't saved us. The real danger had always been here, waiting in the dark. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard a sound, a faint hum, barely audible above the cacophony of whispers. It was coming from the ground beneath me, from the very earth that had swallowed us into this twisted void. The sigil. The ritual wasn't finished yet. There was still one thing left to do. My heart pounded as the realization hit me. Mrs. Garrison had said the crypt was a doorway, a gateway to another place. The seal could trap the entity, but we hadn't closed the gate. It was still open, still bleeding darkness into our world. That's why the Watchers were still here. But there was one way to shut it. One final step. Blood. I looked down at the ground beneath me, my hands trembling as I pressed my palm to the earth. My skin was slick with blood from the wound I'd opened earlier with the dagger. The ancient sigil carved into the crypt's door glowed faintly, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. I could feel it calling to me, demanding more. The ritual needed a final sacrifice. I had to give it everything. Without thinking, I grabbed the dagger from where it had fallen. The Watcher was distracted, savoring Claire's suffering as it choked the life from her. I knew I had only seconds before it crushed her completely. Before it took us both. I had to act. I took a deep breath and plunged the dagger into my own hand, twisting it deeper as blood poured from the wound. The pain was blinding, sharp and hot, but I forced myself to focus. I pressed my bleeding hand against the ground, the sigil pulsing brighter, as if drinking in the blood, feeding on the sacrifice. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, as if the Watchers sensed what I was doing. They turned toward me, their hollow eyes narrowing, their mouths moving faster, the air around me thickening with their hatred. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I forced my voice to rise above the whispers, my words shaking but steady. I bind this gate. I seal this door. By blood, by sacrifice, I close the path between worlds. The ground beneath me shook violently, the sigil glowing with a blinding light that seemed to cut through the darkness. The air crackled with energy, the whispers becoming screams, high-pitched, inhuman shrieks that tore through the void. The Watcher holding Claire faltered, its grip loosening as it turned to me, its hollow eyes wide with rage. But it was too late. The sigil had taken hold. The ground split open beneath us, a jagged crack tearing through the earth as the void itself seemed to ripple and bend. The light from the sigil pulsed brighter, growing stronger with every drop of blood I gave it. The Watchers recoiled, their twisted forms flickering, like shadows cast by dying flames. The one holding Claire let out a piercing shriek, its grip slackening as it dropped her to the ground. She collapsed in a heap, gasping for air, her eyes wide with shock. I barely had time to process her survival before the other Watchers began to dissolve, their bodies twisting and writhing as they were sucked back into the void. The earth beneath us shook harder, the crack widening, pulling the darkness back into itself, sealing the gateway. But the Watcher, the one that had held Claire, it didn't retreat like the others. It turned toward me, its hollow eyes burning with fury. Its twisted grin stretched wider, its teeth sharp and glistening with oily black ichor. "No!" it shrieked, its voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You can't seal me away! I will take you with me!" It lunged at me, faster than I could react. Its hand closed around my throat, icy cold and burning all at once. My vision blurred, the world tilting as the Watcher pulled me toward the crack in the earth. "You will join us," it hissed, its face inches from mine. "Your soul will be ours." I gasped for air, my mind reeling as I felt myself being dragged closer to the edge. The light from the sigil was fading, the crack in the ground sealing itself, but the Watcher was determined to take me with it. I struggled, my hands clawing at its grip, but it was too strong. The darkness swirled around me, pulling me in. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest, squeezing the life from me. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard Claire's voice. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with fear and anger. "You're not taking her!" Before I could react, Claire was on her feet, the dagger in her hand. She lunged at the Watcher, driving the blade into its back with a fierce, primal scream. The creature let out a howl of agony, its grip on my throat loosening as it staggered backward, black ichor spilling from the wound. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the Watcher writhed in pain. Claire yanked the dagger from its back and drove it in again, her face twisted in fury. "You're not taking her!" she screamed, her voice trembling with emotion. The Watcher's body convulsed, its form flickering, distorting, as the crack in the earth sealed itself completely. The sigil flared one last time, a blinding light that filled the void with a searing brilliance. And then, with a final, tortured scream, the Watcher dissolved into the light, its body disintegrating into nothingness. The light dimmed, the whispers faded, and the ground beneath us stilled. It was over. Claire collapsed beside me, her chest heaving, her face pale and streaked with tears. I reached out, my hand shaking, and grasped hers, squeezing it tightly. We lay there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. The crypt door stood silent, sealed once more. The watchers were gone. We had won. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped entirely. The gate was sealed, yes, but the watchers had seen us. They had touched us. And they would be waiting. Always watching. Always waiting for the next time the door would open.